Welcome back to the Vue 3 Beginner Tutorial series. In the previous episode, we learned how to render collections of data using Vue's V for directive. Today, we'll learn another essential Vue feature, passing data between components using props. If you remember episode 4, we created our very first reusable component called UserCard. Back then, every UserCard displayed exactly the same information because the content was hard-coded inside the component. That was enough to understand how components work, but it wasn't very practical. Today, we'll make that component truly reusable by allowing each instance to display different data using props. If you haven't watched episode 4 yet, I highly recommend checking it out first, since we'll continue working with the same component throughout this lesson. So, what exactly are props? So far, every component we've created contained its own data. Our UserCard component always displayed the same name and the same job title. But in real applications, that's rarely what we want. Imagine building a page that displays dozens of users. Creating a separate component for every single person would quickly become impossible to maintain. Instead, we create one reusable component and simply provide different data every time we use it. This is exactly what props are for. Props allow a parent component to pass data down to a child component. You can think of props as custom attributes that carry information from one component to another. This makes components much more flexible and reusable. Now that we understand the idea behind props, let's go back to the UserCard component we created in episode 4 and improve it. Here's the UserCard component we built earlier. At the moment, every card displays exactly the same information. As you can see, all 3 cards look identical. Instead of hard-coding that information, let's make our component configurable using props. Right now, both the user's name and job title are hard-coded directly inside the component. That means every time we render this component, we'll always see the same user. Let's change that. To receive data from a parent component, Vue provides a special compiler macro called defineProps. We'll use it inside the script setup block. Inside it, we define our props by passing an array that contains the names of every prop this component expects to receive. For now, our component only needs one prop called name. This tells Vue that the parent component can pass a value named name into this component. Notice that we're simply providing the prop name as a string inside the array. This is the simplest way to define props, and it's perfect for getting started. Later in the series, we'll also look at more advanced ways to define and validate props. Instead of displaying a hard-coded value, we're now reading the value from our props object. Whenever the parent component passes a different name, this heading will update automatically. Just like we've done in previous lessons, we're using interpolation to display a reactive value inside the template. The only difference is that this value now comes from the parent component instead of being defined inside the component itself. Now that our component is ready to receive data, we need to provide it from the parent component. Passing a prop is very similar to adding a regular HTML attribute. We're simply assigning a value to the name prop. Every component instance can receive a completely different value. And because each instance receives its own data, the same component becomes much more reusable. As you can see, we're still rendering exactly the same component 3 times. The only difference is the data each component receives from its parent. This is one of the biggest advantages of using props. Instead of creating multiple nearly identical components, we create one reusable component and customize it by passing different values. Passing a single value is a great start, but in real applications, components usually need much more information than just a user's name. Let's see how we can pass multiple props to a component. Passing a single prop already makes our component much more reusable. But in most real applications, a component needs more than just one piece of information. For example, our UserCard should display not only the user's name, but also their job title. Let's add another prop. Adding more props is easy. We simply include another prop name inside the array. In this case, we added a prop called job title. Our component now expects two values from its parent component, a user's name and their job title. Just like before, we're using interpolation to display the value inside the template. Now both pieces of information come directly from the parent component. Now let's pass the second prop from the parent. Notice that we're simply adding another attribute to the component. As you can see, every card now displays completely different information. Even though we're rendering the same component 3 times, each instance receives its own set of props. This is what makes Vue components truly reusable. So far we've been passing plain text values, but props can also receive reactive data. Let's see how that works. Instead of writing the value directly inside the component, let's store it inside a reactive variable. We've already worked with ref earlier in this series, so this should look familiar. At the moment, our variable contains the value John Doe. Now let's pass that variable as a prop. Notice the colon before the prop name. This is very important. Without the colon, Vue treats the value as plain text. With the colon, Vue evaluates the JavaScript expression instead. This means we're no longer passing a string. We're passing the actual value stored inside the reactive variable. To make this easier to see, let's add a button that changes the value of our variable. As soon as the value changes, the user card updates automatically. We didn't touch the child component at all. Vue's reactivity system takes care of everything for us. This means that every time the parent updates its reactive data, the child component automatically receives the new value through its props. One small detail you may have noticed is the prop name we used. Inside JavaScript, it's written one way, but inside the template, it looks slightly different. Let's take a closer look. When working with props, you'll often notice 2 different naming styles. Inside JavaScript, it's common to use camelCase. That's why our prop is called job title. However, inside templates, Vue recommends using kebab-case, which separates words with hyphens. That's why we write job-title when passing the prop. Fortunately, Vue automatically maps these names together. So job title inside your component and job-title inside the template both refer to exactly the same prop. If you're ever unsure which style to use, here's a simple rule to remember. Use camelCase when writing JavaScript, and kebab-case when writing component attributes inside templates. So far, we've passed a reactive string to our component using the name prop. However, props aren't limited to strings. A prop can receive almost any JavaScript value, making components much more flexible. Let's take a quick look at the most common data types you can pass. Strings are useful for simple text values. Numbers can represent things like age, price, or quantity. Booleans are commonly used to enable or disable features. Arrays are useful whenever a component needs to work with a collection of values. And finally, objects let us group related information together into a single value. Now that you've seen the different types of values a prop can receive, let's look at the approach you'll use most often in real Vue applications. So far, we've been passing the user's name and job title as separate props. This works perfectly fine for small examples. However, as components become more complex, passing lots of individual props quickly becomes difficult to manage. Instead, developers usually group related data into a single object and pass that object as one prop. Let's refactor our example. Instead of storing only the user's name, we'll create a user object that contains all the related information. Right now, it contains the name and job title, but we could easily add more properties later if we needed to. Now, instead of passing multiple props, we're passing a single object that contains everything the component needs. Since the component now expects a single user object, we only need one prop called user. To access data inside the object, we simply use dot notation. First, we access the user prop, and then the property we want to display. In this case, we're displaying the user's name and job title. As you can see, the component still behaves exactly the same. The only difference is that our data is now grouped together in a single object. This approach makes components easier to read, easier to maintain, and much easier to extend as your application grows. For example, if we later wanted to display the user's age or email address, we could simply add another property to the object instead of creating more individual props. So, for small components, passing individual props is completely fine. But once you have several related values, passing a single object is usually the cleaner and more scalable solution. Before we finish, there's one very important rule you should remember. Props are read-only. A child component can use the data it receives, but it should never modify it directly. Let's see what happens if we try. If we try to change a prop inside the child component, Vue immediately warns us that this isn't the correct approach. The reason is simple. The parent component owns the data. The child component only receives it. This creates a clear one-way flow of information that's much easier to understand and maintain. A good rule to remember is this: data flows down from the parent to the child through props. If a child component needs to request a change, it shouldn't modify the prop directly. Instead, it should notify the parent. We'll learn exactly how that works in the next episode, where we'll introduce component communication using emits. Before we wrap up, there's one more useful feature worth knowing about. Let's see how Vue can help us validate props during development. So far, we've been defining props using a simple array of names. For small examples, that's perfectly fine. However, in real applications, we often want to describe what kind of data a prop should receive. Vue allows us to do this using prop validation. Instead of passing an array, we can provide an object. Here, we're telling Vue that the user prop is expected to be an object. This doesn't change how the component behaves, but it makes the component easier to understand and allows Vue to validate incoming props during development. We can also define additional options for each prop. The type property specifies the expected data type, and required tells Vue that this prop must always be provided by the parent component. These options make your components easier to understand and help catch mistakes while you're developing your application. Because we told Vue that this prop should be an object, it immediately warns us when we pass the wrong data type. Warnings like this help catch bugs much earlier, before they become bigger problems. Type checking is just one of the validation features Vue provides. Let's take a look at a few other useful options. Besides specifying the expected type, you can also mark a prop as required, provide a default value, or define a custom validator for more advanced validation rules. We won't cover these options in detail today, but it's useful to know they're available. As your applications grow, prop validation helps make your components more predictable, more reliable, and easier to use. Before we finish, let's quickly go over a few best practices. Props should always be used to pass data from a parent component to a child component. Never modify props directly inside the child component. If several values belong together, consider grouping them into a single object. Whenever possible, use prop validation to make your components easier to understand and maintain. And finally, try to design your components so they can be reused in different parts of your application. Following these simple guidelines will help you build cleaner and more maintainable Vue applications. Today, we learned how components can receive data using props. We started by creating our first prop and saw how it makes components reusable. Then we passed reactive data from a parent component, explored different types of props, learned why passing objects is often the preferred approach, and discovered that props should always remain read-only. Finally, we introduced prop validation to make our components more reliable and easier to maintain. These concepts form the foundation of component communication in Vue. In the next episode, we'll learn how child components can communicate back to their parents using emits. You'll discover how to create custom events, send information from child components, and complete the communication pattern between Vue components. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.